Mounce, BBG, Chapter 14, Sentence 3. Here we go. This one you look at and you go, wow, it's so long and it looks like it's so difficult, but it's really not that tough, folks. Main thing you need to know is when you look at it, relative pronoun, relative pronoun, relative pronoun, relative pronoun. So you basically have a string of relative clauses. And once again, one of the ways you can help yourself is to separate out the relative clause or relative clauses in this case and make sure that the sentence makes sense on its own without any relative clauses. And essentially that's what you're going to find to be the case here is once you've yanked all of that, what you're left with is right here. And he already gave you the verb, which has got the subject built in. And day, of course, can be either and or but, and I would encourage you most of the time to just go with and, as a matter of fact. But once again, I make known to you. Again, you see the dative here, second person personal pronoun in plural, and what you've got is the iota to tell you that it's in the dative. And then you have brethren. I make known to you, brethren, the gospel. Period. So once again, you basically have a sentence that makes perfect sense without any relative clauses attached, and that's going to help you once you start looking at the relative clauses. What I would recommend is you take each relative clause by itself and just make sure you understand what's happening. So if you go with who or which, in this case we're going to go with which I preach to you, and again you got whom in again. So then you come back to the relative pronoun and you say, all right, how is that working within the relative clause? Case, number, gender. Case, you look to the right. Number, gender, you look to the left. Well, if you look at that relative pronoun, you know that it has to be neuter. Again, if you're not sure, because you're going, man, it looks like it's masculine, looks like it's singular, looks like the definite article. But remember that this declines more like the inflections than the definite article. So again, if you're confused, if that's not fitting together for you, pull out your laminated sheet, look at the bottom left of the front page, and you see the relative pronouns there, and you'll recognize that this is neuter, singular, and it's either nominative or accusative, which is what the neuter does. So you're going to say, okay, number gender being singular has got to line up with something that is singular and neuter before it, which to euangelion is the most likely culprit. And of course, we know that to euangelion, looking at it, we can tell that it is a neuter singular. So you've got the number gender figured out in terms of lining it up with the antecedent. So then you go, okay, well, case, we know that it's either nominative or accusative, and I'm trying to figure that out. So I may have to do something like this on a final exam. So I need to know what case it is. We know that it could be either nominative or accusative. So we say, well, could it be nominative? Could it be the subject? Well, your verb there is I preached. Already got the subject built in, and the subject is I. So that's not going to line up with the relative pronoun. Well, I guess it hypothetically could, but knowing that the antecedent is gospel, you'd have to say the gospel preached. And the gospel isn't what's it isn't preaching. The gospel is what's preached. So what makes more sense is to say, well, okay, it's either nominative or accusative. And if we treat it as accusative and replace the direct object, then it's I preach the gospel to you. Well, makes good sense to me. So there we say for case, accusative, because it's replacing the direct object within the relative clause. Okay. All right. Second clause. Again, we have the same animal. So number gender, going to go back to the antecedent. Guess what? It's going to go back to the same antecedent as is everything else in the rest of the sentence, by the way. But it's going to go back to the gospel each time. So number and gender we already have figured out. But then we got to go, okay, still got to figure out whether it's nominative or accusative. Well, we know that the verb is a second person plural, which means that the subject has to be y'all, and that's not going to work with a singular relative pronoun. So that's just not going to work. So we know that this, in this case, again, it's got to be accusative. And then you say, well, y'all received the gospel. Makes perfect sense. Therefore, ho is accusative. Now, the trick here is that you have these kais that occur several times in the sentence. Just remember that kai can be either and, even, or also. And because you've got a string, it's this and also this and also this, also is probably going to be your best bet when you have a string of things and you have a kai that's sort of linking them together. Okay? So you have, I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which also y'all received, and then in which y'all stand. All right, so in which, now here you have a change and you say, well, wait a minute, I got this relative pronoun, but now it's in the dative, or more technically the locative, for those of you who are have been studying that a little bit more deeply. But bottom line is, when you see that iota subscript, you say, okay, that's dative singular. And then you say, well, wait a minute, how does that line up in terms of how it's used within the relative clause? Well, duh, it follows a preposition. And guess what? N takes the dative, so it has to be in that because it's the object of the preposition. Even though it's a relative pronoun, it's the object of the preposition. And then you can say, also y'all stand. And again, remember, it's pointing back to gospel. Also, y'all stand in the gospel. Makes perfect sense. But again, just treat it, recognize that it's the object of a preposition, and that's why it has to be in the dative, because it has to line up with the preposition. And that's what you're going to find in this next clause, next relative clause as well, through which also y'all are saved. So through which, you're looking at this and you're going, well, wait a minute, it's a genitive. Why is it a genitive? Well, guess what? Dia takes the genitive. And because who, this relative pronoun, is technically the object of the preposition, it has to line up in terms of case with the preposition. Again, though, in every one of these relative clauses, the antecedent is every time the gospel. I preached the gospel to you. Y'all received also the gospel. Y'all stand also in the gospel. Y'all are saved also through the gospel. So again, it's always going to be that neuter singular in terms of number and gender, because it has to be neuter singular to line up with the antecedent. Number and gender, you look left to the antecedent. Case, you look right to how it functions within the relative clause. Hope that helps. All right.